Okay, so let's talk about combat width. I'll be fair with you guys. If you think anyone has discovered the meta of combat width, they're lying. And that includes me. That includes me. If I at ever point have said, I know the meta of combat width now, I'm lying to you. Because for something to become the meta, it has to be tested rigorously. It needs time to mature and find that best optimal strategy. So unfortunately, the bad news is, no, we've not found the meta of combat width at the moment. Because unfortunately, it's not been enough time. Come back to me in a month, 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, a year maybe. Then we'll be able to tell you what the meta is of combat width. But I'm going to give you now my top 3, maybe 4 theories. I'll wing it. I'll assess what I think personally I think is going to happen. So first school of thought. So let's just say here, can you see here? Forest is a combat width maximum of 84 for each additional attack 42. So the first school of thought is, let's ignore the first number, the maximum combat width initially. Because the truth is, whatever you make, you're going to get into that first combat width because that combat width is incredibly wide. 84 is huge. So let's just think to ourselves, if we're going to design a tank division, we want to try and get as many angles of attack as possible to increase the amount of firepower that we can deal to that division as possible. In this case, we'd go with a 42 combat width because that means that every possible angle we can attack into battle, we can provide more firepower from every possible angle. My theory is you aim for a angle which you can do the most amount of firepower. Now, what is the tightest angle in Hearts of Iron 4? 25 for mountain, and marsh is 26. So in that case, tightest combat width would be 25. So if you wanted a division that's a catch-all that tries to fit into as many combat widths as possible when it comes down to fighting capabilities and angles, a potential attack or defense, you would go for a 25 combat width division. Now, I can hear you guys screaming. You're going, but Dave, the first combat width, the initial combat width, will not always be divisible by 25. So therefore, you will suffer from a combat width penalty. Correct! That's right. Unfortunately, due to the new meta of combat width, it is impossible to find a division that will fit into every single possible combat width. So unfortunately, this dream of a combat width that will fit into everything for a division is dead. It's dead and it's gone and it's never coming back. So that's the first theory. If you want a division that is going to basically do everything and fight everywhere, such as infantry, go for a 25 width combat division. It will be able to fit most of the time into every possible combination of combat width, with some exceptions, obviously. And you will, in some cases, suffer from penalties of combat width, where the combat width will be too wide or too narrow, so you will suffer a slight penalty to the amount of damage you will do. But 25 is a really good number because it has a decent amount of firepower, a decent amount of stats. It's basically close to a 7-2. So for the most part, it is a combat width that feels like it is very flexible. So infantry on a front line at 25 combat width would actually be really, really flexible. A little bit of attack, mostly defense, mostly holding back. So that's my school of thought on that. Now, don't get me wrong. I understand that's still going to suffer from penalties. Leading on to my next point. The next school of thought is, what if we make divisions specifically for certain terrain types? So it's quite common you make mountaineers to sit on mountains. How many times have you seen French mountaineers on the Alps or Italian mountaineers on the Alps? It's quite common, isn't it? In that case, they get the best of both worlds. They get the potential defensive bonus of being a mountaineer. Plus, on top of it, you get all the defensive bonuses of mountains full stop anyway. So in that case, if you're making a division for a specific job, you would make it to that combat width because that is where it's most optimal it can potentially fight. And in that case, if it's a mountaineer in mountains, it'd be 25, wouldn't it? Or it would, for instance, if it's a mountaineer in hills, it would be 40 combat width. Oh wow, deja vu. So in that case, these divisions then will fight most optimally in those terrain types. So let's talk about tanks, okay? So tanks most optimally fight in deserts and plains. So the combat width is 90 with 45. So in that case, you could say to yourself, I will only, or most of the time, use tanks in those terrain types of 45. So therefore, I'll make a 45 width tank division. And that's fine. In that circumstance, it is always divisible by 45, so therefore it will fit in every single time. Therefore, you won't suffer from a penalty. And a 45 width tank division is a big tank division, so that will do lots and lots of firepower. But if it's a situation where it's going to be fighting in forests or hills or urban, unfortunately, a lot of the time, it's not going to fit. So in this case, if one division attacks into urban, a 45 combat width, and then another one tries to attack from a different angle, it won't be able to fit because the only additional 32 combat width won't fit in, so it just won't get in there. So in that circumstance, it'll only be one division fighting at all times, which basically is a massive waste of tanks. What's the point of having 2 tank divisions if they can only fight one by one, like in a queue? It's pointless. So the truth is, you probably want to make it the narrowest possible combat width where it will realistically be fighting. So my take on this is, if you're going to make a tank division, it should basically be able to fight in urban, hills, forests, and then obviously the normal ones of plains, as well as deserts. The only exceptions, it won't fight in mountains because tanks already suffer from big penalties in mountains anyway, and also marshes, which tanks tend to get suffer from a big penalty in marshes as well. So why would you make a tank to fight in these terrain types where they won't be fighting there anyway? So in that case, the combat width you would go for in that circumstance is the narrowest, which is 32. So a 32 combat width tank division. Now I know I can hear you guys saying it, but the first number, Dave, the 96, it won't fit in every circumstance. So you're going to suffer from a penalty. Welcome to the new combat width, guys. Unfortunately, not everything will fit in everything equally and fairly. There will be some instances where sometimes you go a little bit over the combat width or a little bit under the combat width. In those circumstances, you may suffer from penalties, the amount of damage that you can actually do. Unfortunately, that's the way the system works at the moment. So you have no choice. You have no choice. So you could make a tank with a one specific role, such as fighting in deserts and plains that'd be 45 combat width. Or you could make a tank that's more flexible, that could fight in a wider round of areas. In this case, you'd make a 32 combat width. Or if you wanted to, you could make a tank division that could fight in all terrain types. But you're kind of hurting yourself because it's going to be 25 combat width. Can you imagine a 25 width combat width tank? It just doesn't have a lot of firepower. And that is the reason why the 40 width meta was a thing with tank divisions, because those tanks at 40 width had so much firepower. Have you guys seen the part 2 of my Soviet Danker style strategy video where the tank divisions just chewed through the front line, just incredible damage? There's always that fear too that if you make the combat width of the division too small, like a really small narrow width, there just won't be enough firepower to make pushes and push forward. And plus it's also a waste of support company equipment as well. And then there's the final school of thought. The final school of thought. You make a division that only works in one combat area. I know I spoke a little bit before, a little bit about like specifically making terrain types, but then you're supposed to specifically making it for everything that's the highest width and everything below it too, like a margin, but avoiding like marsh and mountains on the top, you know? In this circumstance, you could make a division that fights really efficiently in one specific terrain type. So you basically make it divisible by 84, but also additionally do the 42 as well. So in that case, you could make a tank division that fights in mountains incredibly efficiently. But just think about that for a second. You're never going to be fighting in one specific terrain type all around the freaking world. There are circumstances, like if you're in the Belgian Congo, you're only going to be fighting jungles, which is 42 combat width. So I suppose that one instance, because it's forests and mountains, which is all the same, I suppose you could make a specific tank or infantry division to fight in the Belgian Congo. But can you imagine the supply for that? It'd be horrendous. Or for instance, this is probably a really good example actually. The deserts of North Africa, Algeria, Libya, Egypt, to a certain degree the Levant, ignoring the mountains obviously. You're going to make one that's for deserts, but you think about that, a desert tank at 45 combat width is going to be insanely powerful. But in that case, it will fit perfectly into that combat width. So therefore, we'll do the most optimal damage. There's that my 3 thought processes of combat width. What about 30 width tanks? I think the way it tends to work is any small combat width of a tank will work. But remember, the smaller you make your tank, the easier it fits into every combat width. But the downside is that smaller tank divisions, infantry divisions, any division, just doesn't have enough firepower. So you always want to make it larger to get more firepower, but you want to make it smaller so it fits. I mean, there's nothing wrong with 20 width infantry, and there's nothing wrong with 30 width tanks. But remember, if you want to optimize it, which is the purpose of this conversation I'm having with you guys right now, you kind of want to work on those optimizations. What do you recommend for hold the line defensive infantry? 25 combat width. So that would basically be your hold the line division. And for the most part, that is actually a good division because it's got an artillery battalion in it. So in that case, it has got lots of soft attack. But I suppose what you could do is compromise and then go for something like that. That has a lot of fighting power, but it also has stopping power for AA as well. Once again, 25 combat width universally reinforces into every combat width. So therefore, you can never go wrong with this. The combat width on planes doesn't really matter because the terrain debuff of the combat should be focused on the harder terrain types. That's a really good school of thought. Yeah, that's a really good thought process too. Yeah, ignoring the good terrain types and only focusing optimizing and min-maxing the ones that are more difficult, such as mountains and marshes and hills and forests. That's actually a really good idea too. Yeah, like ignoring plains. No, I really am behind that. But I'll say it again, because I know if this video goes on my second channel, you guys are going to be screeching in the comments. But you're going to go like, but Dave, the first number isn't divisible by X, Y, and Z, so therefore you suffer from a penalty. I know, because there isn't a combat width that specifically fits perfectly, unless you're making it a division that fits only in that specific terrain type.